Look what we have here. Another token hire pretending she belongs. Edward Blackwood sneered, grabbing Sophia Rossi by the shoulder and dragging her toward the auction stage. The millionaire's grip tightened as he forced the priceless Stradivarius violin into her hands. You want a level playing field so badly? Here's your chance, darling. Play something sophisticated for your superiors. His associates erupted in cruel laughter as cell phones emerged throughout the Symphony Center's grand hall. Blackwood leaned closer, his voice a poisonous whisper that carried across the silent room. When you humiliate yourself up there, remember you brought this on yourself. Your kind always does. Sophia stood, trapped in the spotlight, her catering uniform creased where his fingers had grabbed her. The $2 million instrument felt impossibly heavy in her shaking hands. "Chop, chop!" Blackwood called out, stepping back with a theatrical flourish. "We don't have all day for your little street performance." The first note that escaped her violin silenced every cruel laugh in the room. Have you ever witnessed shame transform into the most powerful form of vindication? 3 hours earlier, Sophia Rossi had tied her hair back in the cramped employee break room of Chicago's most exclusive catering company, her reflection staring back from a tarnished mirror that had seen better days. At 26, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate spaces where she wasn't wanted. Her mother's prescription bottles rattled in her purse, a daily reminder of why she endured the subtle insults and barely concealed disdain that came with serving Chicago's elite. The Symphony of Hope. Charity Gala represented everything Sophia had once dreamed of joining, not serving. The irony wasn't lost on her that tonight's event raised money for inner-city arts programs, while the very people who needed those programs remained unseen, relegated to carrying trays and clearing plates. She'd watched these same philanthropists write checks for causes they'd never personally witness, their charity stopping at the service entrance. Edward Blackwood's reputation preceded him into every room he entered. The 50-year-old real estate magnate had built his empire on the backs of gifted architects he systematically underpaid, particularly those who didn't look like him. His public persona championed equal opportunity and blind hiring. But the discrimination lawsuit his company had quietly settled 8 months ago told a different story. The settlement documents leaked to business journals revealed a pattern of demeaning talented employees of color until they resigned rather than face prolonged legal fights they couldn't afford. Tonight, Blackwood sat at table 1, a position he'd secured with his $3 million donation. The amount guaranteed him influence over which programs received funding, and his history suggested the money would flow toward institutions that already served affluent communities. He'd arrived 30 minutes late, keeping the entire grand hall waiting because timeliness was for people who needed to impress others. The evening's main attraction sat on the auction stage, like a sleeping princess, a 1741 Violin Guarneri violin worth $2.5 million. The instrument had been donated by an anonymous collector specifically to raise funds for the Chicago Youth Symphony, a program that provided free instruments and lessons to children in underserved neighborhoods. The violin represented a promise, a chance for talented young musicians to touch greatness, even if they could never possess it. Sophia had circled that stage 3 times during setup, her fingers unconsciously moving through scales she hadn't played in 3 years. The muscle memory remained strong, hidden beneath the calluses from her 2 jobs. She'd trained at the Curtis Institute of Music on a full scholarship, her talent so undeniable that even the most traditional instructors couldn't ignore it. But talent didn't pay for chemotherapy, and dreams didn't keep the power on when medical bills mounted beyond comprehension. The night her mother was diagnosed, Sophia had been preparing for her junior recital. The piece was Paganini's Caprice No. 24, the same caprice that had earned her the scholarship, the same music that had once made her believe she could overcome the limitations others placed on her future. Instead, she'd withdrawn from school, sold her own violin, and learned that survival sometimes meant sacrificing the very thing that made life worth living. Blackwood's table had been difficult all evening. Extra wine, special food requests that weren't actually special, and the kind of casual discourtesy that wealthy people inflicted on service staff because they could. He'd already sent back his soup twice, not because anything was wrong with it, but because making the Latina waitress return to the kitchen repeatedly seemed to amuse his companions. "These people have no drive," he'd announced loudly enough for Sophia to hear, as she approached with his third replacement bowl, always looking for a handout instead of earning their keep. The comment hit its mark. Sophia's mother had worked 2 jobs her entire life, cleaning hotels by day and caring for elderly neighbors at night. Sophia herself worked catering on weekends and taught private violin lessons on weekdays, picking up extra shifts whenever medical bills demanded it. But to Blackwood and his circle, her existence boiled down to a stereotype they could dismiss without a second thought. As the evening's auction began, the violin's case was opened with ceremonial respect. The instrument's varnish caught the chandelier light, and its curves seemed to promise music that could stir souls. The auctioneer's voice carried across the grand hall as he described the violin's history, its flawless condition, and its potential to transform young lives through the programs it would fund. Sophia watched from the service station, her heart recognizing something her rational mind tried to ignore. The violin called to her across the room, a siren song of possibility she couldn't afford to hear. The moment arrived with the casual cruelty that only absolute power could produce. Blackwood had been watching Sophia throughout the auction, his eyes tracking her movements like a hawk studying its prey. When she approached his table to refill water glasses, he pounced. "Hold it right there, sweetheart," he commanded, his voice cutting through the auctioneer's presentation. The entire grand hall's attention shifted as he stood, his large frame towering over her. "I have a proposal that'll really put this whole arts for all idea to the test." Sophia froze, the water pitcher heavy in her hands. She'd served enough of these events to recognize the danger signs, but escape was impossible with 200 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, gesturing toward the violin on the stage, "we keep pouring money into programs for disadvantaged communities, but do we actually know if these people have any genuine ability?" His smile was a razor's edge. "Here's our opportunity to find out." He grabbed Sophia's elbow, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave a mark. "Since you're here serving the people who actually support society, why don't you show us what all that affirmative action money bought us?" The auction house representative looked appalled. "Mr. Blackwood, the violin is not—" "I'll raise my donation," Blackwood interrupted, his grip tightening on Sophia's arm. $6 million if she can play one complete piece without making a fool of herself. But when she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone here to remember that talent matters more than background. Cruel laughter spread through his table as phones emerged from designer bags. This was entertainment now, a spectacle for social media. Sophia felt the familiar weight of being reduced to a symbol, a representative of her entire heritage, forced to prove her worthiness to people who'd already determined her value. "What's it going to be, darling?" Blackwood's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Are you going to admit you're just here to pour drinks, or are you brave enough to embarrass yourself in front of Chicago's finest?" The violin waited on stage, $2 million of carved wood and possibility. Sophia looked at it, then back at Blackwood's expectant smirk. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite her trembling hands. "I'll play." The walk to the stage felt like a public execution through hostile territory. Every step echoed in the sudden silence as Chicago's elite turned in their chairs, phones already recording what they expected to be a viral failure. Sophia's heart pounded against her ribs, but her stride remained resolute, a defiance born from years of surviving spaces designed to crush her spirit. Blackwood followed close behind, his voice a constant stream of venom. "This should be a learning experience for everyone," he announced to the crowd. "Sometimes a reality check is exactly what people need." The auction house representative hovered nervously by the violin case, his face pale with the knowledge that careers could be destroyed by whatever happened next. "Miss, perhaps we shouldn't let her handle it." "Let her touch it," Blackwood interrupted with theatrical generosity. "I want no excuses when this goes exactly as we all anticipate." Sophia reached the stage and paused before the open case. The Vieux Temple Guarneri lay there like a sleeping masterpiece, its amber varnish glowing under the spotlights. Her hands, steadier now, lifted the instrument with the reverence it deserved. The weight was perfect, the balance exactly what her muscle memory yearned for. "Careful with that," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "It's worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes. Actually, it's probably worth more than your entire family tree will ever contribute to society." The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one spoke out. This was their world, their rules, their amusement. Sophia tested the violin's tuning with gentle precision, each adjustment revealing the depth of her knowledge. Her posture transformed as she positioned the instrument. Back straight, chin rest settled perfectly, bow held with professional poise. The change was so complete that several musicians in the audience leaned forward, recognizing something they hadn't expected to see. "Choose something simple," Blackwood taunted, settling into a front-row seat like a king awaiting a jester's performance. "We wouldn't want you to attempt something beyond your grasp." But Sophia had already made her choice. Not just the piece she would play, but the battle she would fight. This wasn't about Blackwood anymore. This was for every gifted person who'd been told they didn't belong. Every dreamer forced to serve those who'd inherited their advantages. She raised the bow to the strings, closed her eyes, and found her center in the silence before the tempest. The first note emerged like a whisper, answered by seraphim. Paganini's Caprice. Number 24 floated across the symphony center with such crystalline purity that conversations died mid-sentence. The melody, deceptively intricate, yet impossibly demanding, filled every corner of the grand hall with the kind of beauty that made hearts forget to beat. Sophia's bow moved across the strings with surgical precision, each phrase unfolding like petals of sound that had never known imperfection. Blackwood's smug expression faltered within the first 5 seconds. The transformation was complete and undeniable. The timid waitress had vanished, replaced by a virtuoso whose every movement spoke of years spent in pursuit of musical perfection. Her vibrato was silk and fire, her intonation so pure it seemed to bend the very air around her. This wasn't talent. This was artistry of the highest order, the kind that emerged perhaps once in a generation. Phone screens throughout the grand hall captured every note as the audience sat transfixed. At table 7, renowned violinist David Chen slowly lowered his wine glass, his trained ear recognizing a technique that belonged on the world's greatest stages. At table 12, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's concertmaster leaned forward, his professional skepticism crumbling with each perfectly executed phrase. But Sophia wasn't finished revealing her secrets. As Paganini's original theme reached its emotional peak, she began to weave in variations that shouldn't have been possible. Blues harmonies emerged from classical foundations, creating a conversation between centuries of musical tradition. Her improvisation was bold yet reverent, showing not just technical mastery, but a creative genius that transcended formal training. She was speaking multiple musical languages simultaneously, proving that talent didn't recognize the boundaries others tried to impose. The violin itself seemed to come alive in her hands. The Guarneri's legendary voice, which had remained silent for months in its display case, sang with renewed purpose. Every note carried the weight of 3 centuries of musical history, channeled through an artist who understood that great instruments demanded great souls to unlock their secrets. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat, his companions exchanging glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't going according to plan. The humiliation they'd anticipated was transforming into something else entirely, a revelation that threatened everything they believed about who deserved to touch greatness. "Impossible," one of his table-mates whispered loud enough to be caught by nearby phones. Where did she learn to play like that? The answer was written in every movement of Sophia's body. This was Curtis Institute training, conservatory discipline, and natural gifts honed through years of dedication. But more than that, this was the voice of someone who'd been silenced, finding her power again. Each note carried the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Sophia opened her eyes for the first time since beginning. Her gaze found Blackwood's face and held it, her expression calm, yet unmistakably defiant. She wasn't playing for his approval or anyone else's. She was playing because the music demanded to be heard, because talent refused to be buried beneath the weight of others' limitations. The final phrase emerged like a benediction. Paganini's genius filtered through a soul that understood both sorrow and transcendence. The last note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, a perfect sphere of sound that seemed reluctant to fade. When silence finally returned to the grand hall, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. 8 seconds passed before the first person began to clap. Then the Symphony Center erupted. The applause wasn't polite charity gala acknowledgement. It was the thunderous recognition reserved for moments that changed everything. People leaped to their feet, their phones forgotten as they surrendered to the raw emotion of witnessing something extraordinary. Shouts of "Brava!" echoed from the musicians' tables, while tears streamed down faces that had seen everything but had never seen this. Blackwood remained seated, his face a mask of confusion and something approaching dread. The narrative he'd constructed, the comfortable story that allowed him to dismiss entire populations, lay in ruins at his feet. The applause continued, wave after wave of recognition that threatened to drown his worldview entirely. But the most telling moment came from an unexpected source. Blackwood's own wife, Catherine, stood slowly at their table, her hands coming together in applause that grew stronger with each beat. Her eyes, when they met her husband's, carried a message he'd never seen there before. Shame. Deep, undeniable shame for the man she'd married and the values she'd allowed him to represent. Social media was already exploding. Violin Virtuoso began trending within minutes, accompanied by video clips that would be viewed millions of times before the night was over. Comments poured in from around the world, each one a small rebellion against the assumption that talent belonged to any particular group or class. "Who is she?" dominated the live streams. "This is why diversity matters." "When bigotry meets brilliance." The auction house representative approached cautiously, his earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching reverence. Professional musicians were leaving their seats to get closer to the stage, their trained eyes studying Sophia's technique, their ears still processing what they had just witnessed. David Chen was among them, his face wearing the expression of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his recognition of Sophia's playing style triggering memories he thought he'd filed away forever. But Sophia remained on stage, the violin still cradled in her arms like a long-lost companion. The applause washed over her, but her eyes stayed fixed on Blackwood's face. She watched him struggle to process what had just occurred, saw him search desperately for some way to diminish what couldn't be diminished. When he finally stood, his movement cutting through the continued ovation, his voice carried a new edge, one that spoke of a man whose comfortable assumptions had just been shattered in public. "Very impressive," he said, his tone managing to make the compliment sound like an insult. "Anyone can memorize one piece, but real musicians don't just perform, they create under pressure." The grand hall's energy shifted, the celebration pausing as Blackwood's words registered. He wasn't finished. The humiliation he'd planned to inflict on Sophia had backfired spectacularly, but men like Edward Blackwood didn't accept defeat gracefully. They doubled down. "Let's see if you can handle something that actually requires skill," he continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in familiar cruelty. "Something you can't possibly have prepared for." The trap was being reset, but this time, everyone in the room could see it coming. Blackwood's recovery was swift and malicious, like a cornered snake finding new ways to strike. The applause had barely faded when he strode toward the stage with renewed purpose. His earlier shock transformed into something far more dangerous: calculated spite. "That was a lovely parlor trick," he announced, his voice cutting through the lingering appreciation. "But anyone with a recording and enough practice time can memorize a flashy tune." He gestured dismissively toward Sophia, who still stood on stage with the violin. Real musicians prove themselves under real pressure. From his jacket, he produced a folded sheet of music with the theatrical flourish of a magician, revealing his illusion. Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor. First movement, sight reading only. His smile was a razor's edge as he held up the pages. "Let's separate the performers from the pretenders." The grand hall's energy shifted instantly. Musicians in the audience exchanged worried glances. They recognized what Blackwood was demanding. Mendelssohn's concerto was a notorious test piece, filled with technical minefields that could destroy even seasoned professionals. Sight reading it was something typically reserved for conservatory final exams, not public humiliation attempts. But as Blackwood climbed the stage steps, his true cruelty revealed itself. Under the bright spotlights, the sheet music in his hands was clearly damaged. Coffee stains obscured entire measures. Tears had removed crucial passages, and water damage had made key sections completely illegible. This wasn't an accident. It was sabotage disguised as a challenge. "Oops," he said with mock concern, holding up the ruined pages for the audience to see. "Looks like someone was careless with the only copy, but I'm sure that won't be a problem for someone with your extensive training." The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculation. He was demanding perfection while deliberately making it impossible, creating a scenario where failure was guaranteed and humiliation complete. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. This was Blackwood's world. His $3 million donation bought him the right to orchestrate whatever sadistic entertainment he chose. Sophia studied the damaged sheet music, her face betraying nothing as she absorbed the full scope of his trap. Missing measures, illegible passages, entire sections rendered unreadable. It would be musical suicide to attempt this, a professional embarrassment that would follow her for years. The smart play was to decline gracefully, to accept that she'd already proven her point with Paganini. Instead, she handed the ruined pages back to him. "I won't need those," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the grand hall's sound system. Blackwood's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" "Mendelssohn's Concerto in E minor, first movement," Sophia replied, adjusting the violin on her shoulder with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. "I'll play it from memory." The declaration sent ripples of disbelief through the audience. Playing Mendelssohn from memory was difficult enough, but announcing it publicly raised the stakes to impossible heights. One missed note, one forgotten passage, and her earlier triumph would be completely erased by this spectacular failure. Blackwood's laugh was genuinely delighted. Now, how convenient. When you inevitably stumble through a butchered approximation, you can claim the missing sheet music confused you. Very clever. He gestured to the audience like a ringmaster preparing his greatest act. Ladies and gentlemen, witness the delusions of someone who thinks memorizing popular tunes qualifies as classical training. This is what happens when entitlement meets actual standards. The phones came out again, but this time the energy was different. This wasn't anticipation of beauty. This was anticipation of destruction. Social media was already buzzing with updates. Waitress about to crash and burn trying Mendelssohn. The hashtags were shifting from celebration to spectacle. But something had changed in Sophia's posture. The nervous energy that had marked her earlier performance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like amusement. She closed her eyes and tilted her head slightly, as if listening to music only she could hear. "Before I begin," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made even Blackwood pause, "I want everyone here to remember something about Mendelssohn. He didn't write music to impress wealthy patrons at parties. He wrote it to prove that genius comes from places you'd never expect." The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, more charged. Sophia raised her bow, and for just a moment her eyes found Blackwood's face again. "This one's for every person you've ever underestimated," she said. Then she began to play, and the world shifted on its axis. What emerged from the violin defied every law of musical possibility. Mendelssohn's concerto poured forth in waves of technical perfection that left even the most seasoned musicians speechless. Sophia's fingers danced across the fingerboard with supernatural precision, executing runs that typically took years to master while maintaining the lyrical beauty that made Mendelssohn immortal. Every note was exactly where it belonged, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that couldn't be faked or approximated. But this wasn't mere technical display. This was Mendelssohn, as he was meant to be heard. Sophia found the playful wit hidden in the composer's melodies, the mathematical perfection disguised as effortless charm. Her interpretation revealed layers of meaning that even professional recordings rarely captured, proving that she didn't just know the notes. She understood the soul behind them. Blackwood's face drained of color as the impossible continued to unfold before him. This wasn't someone who'd memorized a piece. This was someone who lived and breathed classical music at the highest level. The damaged sheet music forgotten in his hands told the story of his miscalculation. He'd assumed incompetence where genius stood waiting. At table 7, David Chen was no longer just watching. He was studying. His trained eye caught every subtle detail of Sophia's technique, every fingering pattern that spoke of world-class training. The recognition in his face grew stronger with each passing measure. Pieces of a puzzle falling into place with each perfectly executed passage. The audience was beyond applause now. They sat in stunned silence, afraid that any sound might break the spell being woven around them. Phones recorded frantically, but their owners were too mesmerized to check the screens. This was the kind of performance that people would claim they'd witnessed for the rest of their lives. Social media exploded in real-time wonder. Comments flooded in faster than platforms could process them. "This is impossible. Where has she been hiding? I'm crying actual tears. Durifat violin queen forever." As the movement reached its triumphant conclusion, Sophia's bow swept through the final flourish, with an authority that belonged on the world's greatest stages. The last note rang pure and true, hanging in the air like a challenge to anyone who'd ever doubted that excellence could emerge from unexpected places. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand that they'd witnessed something that would change how they saw the world forever. The applause that erupted should have ended everything. Standing ovations swept across the grand hall like wildfire, with even the most skeptical audience members rising to their feet in stunned recognition. But Edward Blackwood wasn't finished. Humiliation had only sharpened his cruelty into something far more dangerous. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the celebration like a chainsaw. "Stop this ridiculous charade right now." The applause faltered, confusion rippling through the crowd as Blackwood stormed across the stage. His face was flushed red with rage, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of his demolished assumptions. "You think I'm stupid?" he snarled, jabbing his finger inches from Sophia's face. "You think any of us are stupid? This whole thing was planned from the beginning." He spun to face the audience, his voice rising to a roar. She obviously had this music memorized before tonight. Probably been practicing for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment to pull off her little sob story performance. Murmurs of uncertainty began to spread through the crowd. Blackwood was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly which doubts to plant and how to nurture them into full-blown suspicion. "Look at her," he commanded, gesturing wildly at Sophia. "Look at those hands. Those aren't waitress hands. Those are musician hands. This woman has been lying to all of us, playing some pathetic con game designed to make us feel guilty for our success." The phones that had been recording in wonder now captured something uglier. The systematic destruction of a miraculous moment by a man who couldn't accept that his worldview was wrong. "And another thing," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "I know exactly what this is about. This is the same shakedown we see everywhere now. Minorities showing up at our events, our spaces, demanding special treatment, and playing the victim when they don't get handed everything on a silver platter." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier wonder now tainted by calculated doubt. Blackwood was rewriting the narrative in real time, transforming a moment of transcendent beauty into something suspicious and scheming. "You want to know the truth about people like her?" He pressed on, his cruelty reaching new depths. "They're professional victims. They study us, learn our weaknesses, then exploit our guilt for their own gain. This whole performance was designed to make us feel bad about being successful." From the back of the grand hall, Sophia's catering manager appeared, his face pale with panic. Michael Evans had built his business serving Chicago's elite, and his entire livelihood depended on maintaining their goodwill. Seeing his employee at the center of this explosive confrontation was his worst nightmare realized. "Miss Rossi," Michael called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to crisis management. "Please step away from the instrument and return to work immediately." The words landed like physical blows. Sophia stood on stage, still holding the violin, caught between the transcendent moment she'd just created and the brutal reality of her economic vulnerability. One phone call from Blackwood could destroy not just her job, but Michael's entire business. "That's right," Blackwood said, sensing victory. "Back to where you belong and take your little performance art project with you." But his cruelest blow was still coming. He leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring every word would be captured for the viral videos already spreading across social media. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "There are probably dozens of actually talented musicians, real musicians from good families with proper training, who will never get opportunities because spots are being handed out to diversity cases like this. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. He was suggesting that Sophia's very presence was theft, that any success she achieved came at the expense of someone more deserving. It was the kind of dog-whistle racism that his crowd understood perfectly, disguised as concern for fairness and merit. Social media began to fracture in real time. The hashtags that had celebrated her moments before now battled with new ones. Diversity scam. Professional victim. Where did she come from? The beautiful moment was being consumed by the very ugliness it had seemed to transcend. Sophia stood frozen, the violin suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. The choice before her was stark. Retreat now and preserve what little security she had, or fight back and risk losing everything. Blackwood smiled as he watched her struggle, certain that he'd finally found the pressure point that would end this embarrassing episode forever. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap, with Sophia trapped between retreat and ruin. Then a voice cut through the toxic air with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding the world's greatest concert halls. "That's enough." David Chen rose from table 7 with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to standing ovations. At 65, he remained one of the most respected violinists alive, his opinion carrying a weight that even Blackwood couldn't dismiss. Every eye in the grand hall turned toward him as he began walking toward the stage. "I know world-class playing when I hear it," David announced, his accented English carrying clearly through the sound system. "And what we just witnessed was extraordinary by any standard." Blackwood's confidence faltered as murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd. David Chen wasn't some bleeding-heart liberal. He was a musical legend whose endorsement could launch careers or end them with a single word. "Furthermore," David continued, reaching the stage with measured steps, "I know this young woman personally. Sophia Rossi was one of my students at Curtis from 2001 to 2004. Full scholarship, top 5% of her class. I wrote her recommendation letters myself." The revelation hit the grand hall like a thunderclap. Blackwood's face went ashen as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. This wasn't some diversity hire or professional victim. This was a Curtis-trained virtuoso whose credentials were now being verified by one of classical music's most respected figures. David reached into his evening bag and produced his phone, swiping through photos with the practiced ease of a grandfather showing off family pictures. "Here she is at her sophomore recital, here's her junior year masterclass with Yo-Yo Ma, and here," he held up the phone for the cameras to see, "is her acceptance letter to the Berlin Philharmonic's Young Artist Program, dated March 2004. The photo showed a beaming Sophia holding an official letter bearing the Berlin Philharmonic's seal. The program David referenced was legendary. Only 6 violinists worldwide were selected each year, and graduates typically went on to join the world's most prestigious orchestras. "She declined the position," David continued, his voice carrying both pride and sadness, "because her mother needed chemotherapy, and the family couldn't afford both the medical bills and her living expenses in Berlin." The human story behind Sophia's absence from the classical music world began to crystallize for the audience. This wasn't failure or lack of talent. This was a sacrifice of the highest order, choosing family over personal glory in a way that made her musical gifts even more profound. Dr. James Peterson, principal violinist for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, stood at table 12. "I remember her audition tape," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of professional validation. "We discussed bringing her in for our fellowship program. David's right. She's conservatory level, possibly beyond." More voices joined the chorus of recognition. Emily Rodriguez, a music critic for the Chicago Tribune who'd been live tweeting the evening, held up her phone. "My followers are sending me performance videos of Sophia from her Curtis days. She was already being compared to the greats before she was 21. The social media tide was turning rapidly. Sophia Rossi began trending alongside Cho Chuig Curtis Prodigy and Xribagt Classical Genius. Comments flooded in from musicians around the world who remembered her performances, her competition victories, her promise that had seemed to vanish into thin air. But the most devastating blow to Blackwood's credibility came from an unexpected source: his own table. Catherine Blackwood stood slowly, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she held her own phone, displaying a charity organization's website. "Edward," she said, her voice carrying across the silent grand hall. "The Melody Project, the charity I've been running for the past 5 years, the one that provides instruments to underprivileged children. Sophia has been volunteering with us for 2 years, teaching violin to kids in Pilsen and Inglewood for free." The final piece of Blackwood's narrative collapsed. Not only was Sophia legitimately trained and extraordinarily talented, but she'd been giving back to her community, even while struggling to survive economically herself. David stepped closer to Sophia, placing a protective hand on his former student's shoulder. "What you've witnessed tonight isn't a scam or performance art," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "It's what happens when privilege tries to crush excellence, and excellence refuses to be silenced." The grand hall erupted in applause again. But this time it carried a different energy, not just appreciation for musical beauty, but recognition of justice being served. Blackwood stood alone on his stage, his empire of assumptions crumbling around him as 200 phones captured his moment of complete defeat. Blackwood's world was collapsing in real time. But cornered predators are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. His face cycled through rage, humiliation, and finally settled on something far more sinister: the cold calculation of a man preparing to burn everything down rather than accept defeat. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "But words are cheap, and stories can be fabricated. If she's really as good as you all claim, then let's put it to the ultimate test." He gestured toward the back of the grand hall, where the evening's scheduled entertainment waited. A full chamber orchestra hired for the gala's closing ceremony. 12 world-class musicians sat with their instruments, having watched the entire drama unfold with professional fascination. "Sibelius's Violin Concerto in D minor," Blackwood announced, his challenge echoing through the suddenly tense grand hall. "Full orchestral accompaniment, no sheet music, no preparation, no excuses. If she can perform at the level you're all claiming, this should be child's play." The audacity of the demand sent shockwaves through the musical community present. Sibelius's Violin Concerto was considered one of the most technically and emotionally demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Performing it with a full orchestra required not just individual brilliance, but the ability to lead and collaborate with other musicians in real time. It was a test typically reserved for the most elite concert soloists in the world. David's face went pale. "Edward, that's completely unreasonable. Even seasoned professionals wouldn't attempt that without rehearsal time." "Then she should decline gracefully," Blackwood interrupted, his smile returning with renewed cruelty. "But let's make this interesting. My entire $6 million donation, the money that funds all these precious diversity programs you care so much about, against a simple public admission." He paused dramatically, ensuring every phone in the room captured his words. "When she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone here to acknowledge that merit-based selection is the only fair way forward. No more diversity quotas, no more special programs, no more handouts disguised as opportunities." The stakes couldn't have been higher. $6 million would fund music education programs for thousands of underprivileged children for years to come. But accepting the challenge meant risking not just personal humiliation, but providing Blackwood with a propaganda victory that could damage diversity initiatives across the entire cultural landscape. And if she succeeds? David demanded, his protective instincts fully engaged. Blackwood's laugh was genuinely amused. If she can perform Sibelius's concerto flawlessly with a full orchestra with no rehearsal and no preparation, then I'll not only honor my donation, I'll double it to $12 million, and I'll personally fund a scholarship program in her name. The grand hall buzzed with electric tension. Social media exploded as the challenge spread beyond the gala to millions of viewers worldwide. The Sibelius challenge began trending instantly, with musicians, critics, and casual observers weighing in on whether such a performance was even humanly possible under these conditions. But the most telling reaction came from the orchestra itself. The musicians began preparing their instruments without being asked, their professional excitement overriding any concerns about the social dynamics at play. This was the kind of musical moment that performers lived for, the chance to witness or participate in something potentially legendary. Conductor Eleanor Vance approached the stage, her expression mixing professional concern with irrepressible curiosity. "Miss Rossi," she said carefully, "performing Sibelius's concerto without rehearsal is, well, it's unprecedented. Even if you know the piece perfectly, coordinating with a full orchestra requires—" "I understand the risks," Sophia interrupted quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made everyone listen more carefully. "But he's not really challenging me to play Sibelius. He's challenging everything I represent, everyone who looks like me, everyone who's been told they don't belong in places like this." She turned to face Blackwood directly, the violin still cradled in her arms like a weapon waiting to be wielded. "You want to make this about more than music? Fine. But when I succeed, not if, when, you're going to do more than write a check. You're going to sit in that front row seat and listen while I prove that excellence doesn't have a color, doesn't have a zip code, and sure as hell doesn't need your permission to exist." The grand hall fell into absolute silence as the full weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just a musical performance anymore. It was a referendum on justice, on merit, on the very nature of who deserved to be heard. Blackwood's smile widened, certain he'd finally created an impossible scenario. "Then let's make history," he said, settling into his front row seat like an emperor awaiting the fall of Rome. Sophia raised her violin, nodded to Conductor Vance, and prepared to prove that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single perfect note. What followed transcended every definition of musical performance and entered the realm of pure magic. The opening orchestral introduction began with the kind of precision that only world-class musicians could deliver. But when Sophia's violin joined the conversation, something extraordinary happened. She didn't just play with the orchestra. She transformed them into an extension of her artistic vision. Every phrase she shaped influenced their dynamics. Every breath she took guided their tempo. Every emotional nuance she expressed elevated their collective performance to heights none of them had experienced before. Sibelius's concerto in D minor became something more than music. It became a dialogue between centuries of human struggle and triumph. Sophia found every hidden voice in the composition, every moment where the composer had embedded his own battles against poverty, alcoholism, and social rejection. She played not just the notes, but the story behind them, the hope that had sustained Sibelius through his darkest moments. The technical demands that should have been impossible became effortless under her bow. The notorious double stops that challenged even seasoned professionals flowed like natural speech. The cadenzas that typically required months of preparation emerged as spontaneous conversations between her soul and the instrument. She was operating beyond technique now, in that rarefied space where music and spirit merged into something approaching the divine. Blackwood's face told the story of a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. The smug certainty had drained away completely, replaced by something approaching terror as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. This wasn't just musical excellence. This was the kind of artistry that redefined what human beings were capable of achieving. The orchestra members themselves were transformed by the experience. Musicians who had performed with the world's greatest soloists found themselves pushed to new heights by Sophia's leadership. Her musical intelligence was so profound that she anticipated their every need, supported their contributions, and elevated their collective performance beyond anything they'd thought possible. Social media had become a global phenomenon. Sophia Rossi was trending in 12 languages as musicians around the world shared the live streams. Comments poured in from conservatory professors, symphony conductors, and critics who were witnessing something they'd never expected to see. The Berlin Philharmonic's official account posted, "The invitation remains open. Always." But the most profound transformation was happening in the audience itself. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was a revelation. Every person in that grand hall was being forced to confront their own assumptions about talent, about worthiness, about who deserved to be heard. The applause that punctuated each movement wasn't just appreciation, it was a confession, a collective acknowledgement of how wrong they'd all been. As the concerto moved toward its triumphant finale, Sophia's playing reached heights that seemed to bend the very laws of physics. The orchestra followed her into musical territory that none of them had ever explored, their faces glowing with the joy of musicians experiencing something truly unprecedented. The final chord rang through the symphony center with the force of a revolution completed. The silence that followed lasted exactly 12 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand that they'd witnessed something that would define the rest of their lives. Then the explosion came. Not just applause, but a sonic eruption of recognition that shook the building's foundations. People weren't just standing. They were weeping, shouting, grabbing strangers in spontaneous embraces of shared witnessing. The orchestra members themselves stood and applauded, their professional reserve shattered by what they had just participated in. Blackwood sat frozen in his front row seat, his face a mask of defeat so complete it bordered on the existential. The $12 million he'd promised was the least of his concerns now. His entire identity had been obliterated by 45 minutes of musical perfection. David Chen was openly crying as he climbed onto the stage, embracing his former student with the fierce pride of a mentor watching a prophecy fulfilled. "The scholarship offer still stands," he whispered. "Berlin, Vienna, London, anywhere you want to go. The world is ready for you now." But the most powerful moment came when Catherine Blackwood approached her husband's seat. In her hands, she carried legal documents that she'd apparently been contemplating for months. "I can't be married to someone who would try to destroy something so beautiful," she said quietly, her words captured by nearby phones. "This ends tonight, Edward. All of it." The transformation was complete. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with such overwhelming beauty that even its targets couldn't deny its power. As the crowd continued its thunderous appreciation, Sophia stood center stage, still holding the violin that had become her instrument of revolution, and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just changed the world. 6 months later, Sophia Rossi stood in the wings of Orchestra Hall, adjusting the collar of her midnight blue concert gown. The sold-out venue buzzed with anticipation as audience members took their seats for what critics were calling the most anticipated classical debut in a generation. Tonight, she would perform Sibelius's Violin Concerto, the same piece that had changed everything, with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Her mother sat in the front row, tears already streaming down her face. The cancer was in remission, the treatments funded by a GoFundMe campaign that had raised over $1 million from people around the world who'd been moved by that viral night at the Symphony Center. Next to her sat David Chen, whose mentorship had resumed immediately after the gala, and Michael Evans, whose catering business now specialized in events celebrating diversity and inclusion. The Vieuxtemps Guarneri violin, the same instrument that had given voice to her revolution, now belonged to the Sophia Rossi Foundation, established with Blackwood's $12 million donation. The foundation provided instruments and training to talented young musicians, regardless of their economic background, ensuring that no one would have to choose between dreams and survival the way she once had. Edward Blackwood's empire had crumbled within weeks of that night. Corporate sponsors abandoned him, his board of directors forced him out, and his company now operated under new leadership committed to genuine diversity initiatives. He'd become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on prejudice. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural. Sophia Rossi had become more than a hashtag. It had become a movement. Music schools reported unprecedented applications from underrepresented communities, while corporations scrambled to examine their own biases in hiring and promotion practices. As the lights dimmed and she walked onto the orchestra hall stage, Sophia carried with her the dreams of everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The thunderous applause that greeted her entrance wasn't just for her. It was for every person who'd chosen excellence over acceptance, who'd refused to let others define their worth. She raised her violin, found her center in the expectant silence, and prepared to remind the world once again that true talent recognizes no boundaries. Sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's excellence, and excellence, once unleashed, can never be silenced again. What would you have played in Sophia's position? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs to remember that their talents matter. Subscribe for more stories of everyday heroes who changed the world, one note at a time.